I'm Jane Drake-Brockman, presenting some key findings from the ABAC report to the APEC Group on Services for the 2021 midterm review of the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap. This work was oversighted by the ABAC Task Force on Strengthening Services, Trade and Investment, chaired by Tom Harley of ABAC Australia, and the ABAC Regional Economic Integration Working Group, chaired by Ho Meng Kit of ABAC Singapore. The first slide shows that the key finding with respect to Roadmap Target 1. The report begins with a very close look at the extent to which APEC is or is not on track with respect to all three of the targets. The first target requires progressive liberalisation of services, and the good news is that although the story is mixed, the business community feels that there has been undoubted significant progressive liberalisation achieved across most services sectors, across roughly 80% of services sectors. And instead of showing in this slide the OECD Restrictiveness Index, what is shown here is the new APEC pilot index showing the services opening up index, which shows you for 2015 to 2020, the first half of the roadmap implementation period, the extent of liberalisation that has been achieved, and it is very real. There's now a larger number of APEC economies that are more open than the world average to international trade in services than the number that is more closed. And ABAC calculates, based on the methodology that the OECD uses for the global data set, ABAC calculates that if by 2025, APEC economies with restrictiveness scores above world average could close half of their regulatory gaps with the best APEC performers, then regional services trade costs could be cut by close to 30%. That is a big deal for business, and that is what business hopes can be achieved in the second half of the roadmap implementation period. Unfortunately, not all the news is good. There is also a red alert, and that is specifically with respect to the business environment for digitally enabled services, which has been poor. And although 2020 saw some improvement as governments eased restrictions around online delivery of services, the fact is the business environment still deteriorated. In 2020 alone, there were 40 new data-related restrictions in APEC economies, mainly on cross-border data flows, on data localization, and on network connection. These restrictions have absolutely mushroomed during the roadmap implementation period. There were nearly 2 to 3 times as many such restrictions introduced in the second half of the decade than in the first half of the decade. So that is not such a good story, as a result of which the second slide shows that ABAC would like to see a new index, which wasn't doable back in 2015, but is doable today, but something that can help us monitor our progress towards greater interoperability and greater seamlessness for digitally enabled services. So ABAC is proposing an indicator for digital regulatory convergence. And this is based on the OECD's heterogeneity work, but what it's showing here is the lower that index, the more regulatory similarity an economy has to the other APEC economies. And ABAC feels it's very important that we start to monitor this regulatory cooperation side of things as well as the opening up side of things. The next slide shows, however, that APEC's clear progress on target 1 has not been sufficient for APEC to really be on track to meet the other roadmap targets. APEC's share of world services exports has not increased. On the contrary, it has fallen. The only conclusion one can make from that is that APEC's competitiveness in services has not improved. It has declined, nor has the compound average annual growth rate of APEC's trade and services increased. On the contrary, it's dropped significantly below historic average. Now, the good news is that domestically inside our APEC economies, the services share of GDP on average is now above the world average. But this disconnect between the bad news on the trade side and the good news domestically has only intensified the challenge which this roadmap set out to address. That is, services industries are not reaching their potential for internationalisation, and the problem has got worse. There is now a full 20 percentage point gap between APEC average services share of domestic value add and export value add. Now, despite this, the business community is optimistic that APEC can get back on track. Services have grown as a percentage of total exports for every APEC economy, and divergence across the region has diminished. The underlying shift towards servicification and digitalisation suggests that with more effort on opening up, more effort on regulatory cooperation, and more effort on stakeholder dialogue, APEC has a very good chance of getting the services trade growth rate back up over the historical average by 2025. ABAC turns then to looking in this report at the 19 action items in the roadmap. And a very brief summary of the overall story is that there are many successful outcomes. Many of them have been very little celebrated and little published, but are really worth celebrating. And the big success stories from a business perspective are the 2018 APEC non-binding principles for domestic regulation of services sectors, completion of the pilot APEC index on measuring the regulatory environment for services, and launch of the virtual APEC business travel card. But some things need to be done. The many work streams under the roadmap need to be better coordinated to sustain the focus on the services dimension. There needs to be more public-private dialogue, and where strong linkages exist between the work in APEC and the work going on in fora such as the WTO, the business community feels that APEC economies should be working in concert to help build critical mass for multilateral outcomes. APEC economies should be participating in the WTO joint initiatives. All of them are pertinent to roadmap action items. The WTO JI on services domestic regulation, which bears much resemblance with APEC's own non-binding principles, warrants APEC support to deliver for the 12th WTO Ministerial Council this year, the first and only outcome on services since the WTO was created. Our measurement is that this step alone would deliver an average 8% cut in regional trade costs for services businesses. That is a really significant step forward. In addition to its overall evaluation and a close look at what happened in 2020, in particular the COVID-19 effect, the business community has come up with a number of concrete ideas and is proposing a collective sprint over the next 4 years to 2025. There are as many as 40 recommendations in this report, 40 recommended GPS resets in those roadmap action items. There are 8 new initiatives, and ABAC is proposing a business partnership to bring them all about. A quick look at what are the 40 recommendations. You will see that some prioritization is given by the business community to areas which it feels were underplayed in the first 4 years. More work on cross-border data flows, more work on structural reform, more work on getting SMEs into global value chains. There are as many as 5 recommendations on environmental services, for example. And the next slide shows, in fact, on services statistics, there are as many as 6 quite precise recommendations for work APEC should take forward, particularly on the pilot APEC index, and a much bigger focus on bringing down those foreign equity limits in investment regimes in the region. So when we come to new initiatives, very, very quickly, what are they? The first is there needs to be in 2021 an APEC declaration on facilitating essential services to match last year's declaration on facilitating essential goods. And it is time to have an initiative also on health services, and particularly online delivery, telehealth and e-health options, and the regulatory environment around that. It's time to share best practices. There is also a need for a work program on e-services, digitally enabled services in multiple sectors. There is clearly a need for work on e-commerce related sectors. Many of these fall into that 20% that have not seen as much liberalisation over the last 4 years as the other parts of the economy. And computer services is a standout in that category. The work that APEC has done on engineering and architecture, it's felt that could be expanded to cover construction, in fact, the whole built environment ecosystem, which is going to be very important to sustainable outcomes going forward. It's time perhaps to bring that cluster of industries together. There has been nearly no work on creative services, multimedia, entertainment, gaming, etc. Now, this is the startup sector. This is the micro SME sector. This is where there is a great deal of innovation. This is where the work is needed to help get those micro SMEs into business-to-business value chains. And ABAC is proposing a focus on export promotion, on sharing of best practices, and perhaps holding a big trade fair in the margins of a CEO summit. It's time also for some work on mining technology services. And a quick final point, the individual action plans are very opaque to business. It's time to have some more frequent monitoring. So finally, ABAC is offering a partnership to deliver many of these outcomes in partnership with APEC governments. The travel and time costs involved in having private sector participation in APEC events is hugely reduced as a result of the new options we have to work online and hybrid face-to-face and online event delivery. What does ABAC expect in return for its partnership? It wants to see a concerted regional response to the pandemic, an intensive effort to attract inward FDI, a reversal of the current fragmentation for the regional market for cross-border online supply of services and cross-border data flows, some really high-impact regulatory cooperation that might actually bring trade costs down for SMEs and achieve a higher level of interoperability, a real reactivation of public-private dialogue on services, and more regional outreach to achieve critical mass on services trade reform at the multilateral level. And finally, as business sees it, international trade performance is just the flip side of the domestic economy, productivity, competition policy, structural reform side of the coin. It's very important that we bring those two sides of the coin together and make sure they are aligned. These next 4 years of roadmap implementation and indeed setting out to achieve now the Putrajaya vision requires a concerted action. It will take all APEC Fora working together to bring about these objectives. I'll leave it there. Thank you.